The first time she saw it, she thought it was a trick of the light. Emma had been walking home from work, her heels clicking against the wet pavement as the rain drizzled down in a fine mist. The streetlights flickered, casting long shadows that danced like specters on the ground. She was tired, her mind foggy from a long day at the office, and she barely noticed the figure at first. It was only when she turned the corner onto her quiet residential street that she saw it, a woman standing beneath the flickering glow of a street lamp, her back turned to Emma. The woman was wearing the same coat, the same scarf, the same shoes. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. The woman's posture was eerily familiar, the way she stood with her shoulders slightly hunched, her head tilted just so. Emma's heart began to pound as the woman slowly turned around. It was her. The same face, the same eyes, the same expression of shock and confusion. Emma stumbled backward, her bag slipping from her shoulder and hitting the ground with a dull thud. The doppelganger, because that's what it had to be, stared at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Its eyes were hollow, empty, like two black voids that threatened to swallow her whole. "Who are you?" Emma whispered, her voice trembling. The doppelganger didn't respond. It simply stood there, watching her with that same unnerving stare. Emma's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Was she hallucinating? Had she finally cracked under the pressure of her job, her life, her loneliness? Before she could think of what to do, the doppelganger turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the alley across the street. Emma stood there for what felt like an eternity, her heart pounding in her chest, before she finally gathered the courage to pick up her bag and hurry home. The next day, Emma tried to convince herself it had been a figment of her imagination. She had been tired, stressed, and the rain had distorted her vision. That was all. But as she sat at her desk at work, typing away at her computer, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her coworkers chatted idly around her, oblivious to the unease that gnawed at her insides. And then she saw it again. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of someone standing in the hallway outside her office. She turned her head, her breath hitching in her throat, and there it was, the doppelganger. It stood perfectly still, its face expressionless, its eyes locked on hers. Emma's hands trembled as she pushed back her chair and stood up. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice louder than she intended. Her coworkers looked up, startled. "Emma? Are you okay?" one of them asked. Emma pointed to the hallway. "Don't you see her? She's right there." Her coworkers followed her gaze, but the hallway was empty. "See who?" another coworker asked, frowning. Emma's stomach churned. She stepped out into the hallway, her heart racing, but the doppelganger was gone. There was no trace of it, no sign that it had ever been there. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the events of the day over and over again. She had seen it. She knew she had. But no one else could see it. What did that mean? Was she losing her mind? She got up and poured herself a glass of water, her hands still shaking. As she stood in the kitchen, she caught a glimpse of movement outside the window. Her heart leapt into her throat as she turned and saw the doppelganger standing in her backyard, its face pressed against the glass. Emma screamed, dropping the glass. It shattered on the floor, sending shards of glass skittering across the tiles. She backed away, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps, but the doppelganger didn't move. It just stood there, staring at her with those hollow, empty eyes. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her fingers fumbling over the buttons. "There's someone in my backyard," she shouted when the operator answered. "Please, send someone." The police arrived within minutes, but by the time they got there, the doppelganger was gone. They searched the backyard, the surrounding area, but found nothing. No footprints. No signs of forced entry. Nothing. "Are you sure you saw someone?" one of the officers asked, his tone skeptical. Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I saw her. She was right there. She looked just like me." The officers exchanged a glance, and Emma knew what they were thinking. She was hysterical. Delusional. Crazy. The days that followed were a blur. Emma stopped going to work, too afraid to leave her house. She boarded up the windows, locked the doors, and kept the lights on at all times. But no matter what she did, the doppelganger always found a way to get to her. It appeared in the mirror when she brushed her teeth, its reflection staring back at her with a twisted smile. It stood at the foot of her bed at night, watching her as she tried to sleep. It followed her from room to room, always just out of reach, always silent. Emma's sanity began to unravel. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping. She spent hours pacing the house, muttering to herself, trying to figure out what the doppelganger wanted. Was it a ghost? A demon? A manifestation of her own fears and insecurities? She didn't know. All she knew was that it was real, and it was tormenting her. One night, Emma couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed a knife from the kitchen and confronted the doppelganger as it stood in the living room, its head tilted to the side as if studying her. "Leave me alone," she screamed, brandishing the knife. "What do you want from me?" The doppelganger didn't respond. It simply smiled, a cold, lifeless smile that sent chills down Emma's spine, and took a step toward her. Emma's hands trembled as she tightened her grip on the knife. "Stay back," she warned, her voice breaking. But the doppelganger kept coming, its movements slow and deliberate. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, her mind racing. She couldn't let it get to her. She couldn't let it win. With a cry of desperation, she lunged at the doppelganger, plunging the knife into its chest. But instead of blood, a thick, black ooze seeped from the wound, dripping onto the floor with a sickening plop. The doppelganger didn't flinch. It didn't scream. It just kept smiling as it reached out and wrapped its cold, bony fingers around Emma's throat. Emma gasped, struggling to breathe as the doppelganger's grip tightened. She clawed at its hands, but they were like iron, unyielding. Her vision blurred as the room spun around her, and she felt herself slipping into darkness. When Emma woke up, she was lying on the floor of her living room. The knife was still in her hand, but there was no sign of the doppelganger. She sat up, her head pounding, and looked around. The house was silent. Empty. She got to her feet, her legs wobbling beneath her, and stumbled to the bathroom. She needed to wash her face, to clear her head. But when she looked in the mirror, she froze. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't her. It was the doppelganger. Emma screamed, backing away from the mirror, but the doppelganger's reflection followed her, its hollow eyes filled with a malevolent glee. She turned and ran out of the bathroom, her heart pounding in her chest. But no matter where she went, the doppelganger was there. In every mirror. In every window. In every shadow. It had become a part of her. Days turned into weeks, and Emma's life became a living nightmare. She couldn't escape the doppelganger. It was always there, always watching, always waiting. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped caring. Her once pristine home became a cluttered, filthy mess, and her once vibrant personality faded into a hollow shell of what it had been. One night, as she sat on the floor of her living room, staring at the boarded-up windows, she heard a voice. "Emma." She froze, her blood running cold. The voice was hers, but it wasn't coming from her. It was coming from behind her. She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, and saw the doppelganger standing in the doorway. Its hollow eyes bored into hers, and its lips curled into a twisted smile. "It's time," it said, its voice a chilling echo of her own. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the doppelganger stepped toward her. She tried to move, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. She was paralyzed, frozen in place as the doppelganger reached out and placed its cold, bony hand on her chest. And then, with a sudden, violent force, it pushed. Emma felt herself falling, tumbling into a void of darkness. She screamed, but no sound came out. She reached out, but there was nothing to grab onto. She was falling, falling, falling. When Emma opened her eyes, she was standing in her living room. The house was clean, the windows unboarded, the lights bright and cheerful. She looked down at herself and saw that she was wearing a fresh set of clothes, her hair neatly styled, her makeup perfectly applied. But something was wrong. She felt different. Like she was no longer in control of her own body. She tried to move, but her limbs moved on their own, as if guided by some unseen force. And then she saw it. In the mirror across the room, her reflection stared back at her. But it wasn't her. It was the doppelganger. Emma's heart raced as she realized what had happened. The doppelganger had taken over. It had pushed her out of her own body, trapping her in this strange, shadowy realm. She tried to scream, to fight, but it was no use. She was powerless. The doppelganger smiled, a cold, lifeless smile, and turned away from the mirror. It walked to the door, opened it, and stepped outside into the bright, sunny day. Emma watched helplessly as the doppelganger walked down the street, blending in with the crowd. No one noticed anything unusual. No one suspected that the woman walking among them wasn't really Emma. But Emma knew. And she would spend the rest of her days trapped in the darkness, watching as the doppelganger lived her life, wore her face, and destroyed everything she had ever loved. The doppelganger walked with purpose, its steps confident and assured. It had waited so long for this moment, and now it was finally free. Free to live. Free to take over Emma's life. It entered the office building where Emma had worked, greeting her coworkers with a smile. They didn't notice anything different about her. To them, she was still the same Emma, friendly, hardworking, dependable. But the doppelganger knew better. It knew that it was nothing like the real Emma. It was something darker, something more sinister. As it sat at Emma's desk, typing away at her computer, it couldn't help but smile. It had won. It had taken everything from Emma, her life, her identity, her very soul. And no one would ever know. Emma floated in the darkness, her mind a jumble of fear and despair. She had no idea how long she had been there, hours, days, weeks. Time had no meaning in the void. She tried to scream, to cry, but no sound came out. She was alone, completely and utterly alone. And then she heard it, a faint, distant sound. It was a voice, whispering her name. Emma. She turned, her heart pounding, and saw a faint light in the distance. It was small, barely more than a pinprick, but it was there. Hope surged within her as she began to move toward the light. She didn't know what it was, but it was something. Something other than the endless darkness. But as she got closer, the light began to flicker, and she realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't a way out. It was the doppelganger, watching her from the other side. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice echoing in the void. "You're mine now." Emma's heart sank as the light faded, leaving her once again in the darkness. She was trapped, forever at the mercy of the doppelganger. And somewhere, in the depths of the void, the doppelganger laughed. Ethan and Claire had always wanted a child. Years of failed fertility treatments had left them emotionally drained, so when the agency called about a young boy needing a home, they didn't hesitate. His name was Oliver. He was 6 years old, pale-skinned, and unsettlingly quiet. The social worker warned them that Oliver had never spoken a word in his life. No babbling as a baby, no first words, no cries. He wasn't deaf, wasn't mute, just silent. Claire had brushed off the warning. "He just needs love," she told Ethan, squeezing his hand. "We can give him that." Their first weeks with Oliver were filled with cautious optimism. He was eerily well-behaved, never throwing tantrums, never demanding attention. He simply watched them with wide, unblinking eyes, his presence like a shadow in their home. At night, he sat cross-legged in his bed, staring at the wall until sleep took him. The house had always been quiet, but now it felt different. Stifling. Heavy. As if the walls were pressing inward, listening. Oliver's silence wasn't just the absence of speech, it was something deeper, something unnatural. The way he moved, the way he watched, it unsettled Claire more than she wanted to admit. Then came the whispers. It started as a faint sound, low murmurs that Ethan dismissed as the wind or the old pipes in their Victorian house. But Claire wasn't so sure. The noises seemed to originate from Oliver's room. More specifically, from Oliver himself. One evening, as she passed his door, she heard it clearly. A voice. Low, guttural, speaking in a language she didn't recognize. The hair on her arms stood on end. She held her breath, pressing her ear to the door. The whispering was rapid, feverish, layered, as though multiple voices were speaking at once. Her pulse pounded in her throat. She turned the knob slowly, pushing the door open. Oliver sat on the floor in the darkness, his back to her. The air in the room was different, colder, dense with something unseen. Shadows pulled unnaturally in the corners. His lips weren't moving, yet the voice continued, relentless, insidious. "Oliver," she called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The voice stopped. The room fell into suffocating silence. Oliver turned his head, moving too slowly, too precisely. His wide eyes found hers, empty and bottomless. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Claire exhaled, relief washing over her, but then something else breathed against her ear. A voice, rasping, hungry. "He's listening." A cold rush of air slid down her spine, and she stumbled back with a strangled cry, slamming the light switch on. The room flooded with brightness, revealing nothing but Oliver, still sitting there, still watching. But the feeling lingered. The heavy presence. The certainty that something else had been there, just moments ago. Oliver blinked slowly. And then, a smile. Small, almost imperceptible, curling at the edges of his lips. Claire fled the room, heart hammering, locking herself in the bathroom. She splashed cold water on her face, gripping the sink until her knuckles turned white. She tried to convince herself it was just exhaustion, just paranoia. But in the silence, beyond the door, she swore she heard it again. A whisper. Laughing. Ethan didn't believe her. "You were dreaming," he insisted. Sleep deprivation does weird things to the mind. Claire wanted to believe him. But the next night, the whispers returned, louder this time. More insistent. She shook Ethan awake. "Listen," she whispered. From down the hall, Oliver's room buzzed with that inhuman murmur. Ethan's skepticism melted as he sat up, face draining of color. He grabbed the baseball bat from beneath the bed and motioned for Claire to stay put. She followed anyway. The whispers grew frenzied as they neared the door. The air felt electric, charged with something unseen, something watching. Ethan flung it open. Silence. Oliver sat on his bed, eyes wide, expression blank. The room was ice cold, the shadows in the corners darker than they should be. Then, from behind them, the closet door creaked open. A low chuckle echoed from within. Ethan spun, bat raised. The closet was empty, but the darkness inside it was wrong, deeper than a shadow should be, shifting as if alive. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "We're leaving." He reached for Oliver, but the child jerked away, staring at him with something close to fear. Then the bedroom light flickered out. And all hell broke loose. The walls trembled, the room filling with a cacophony of whispers. The temperature plummeted, their breath misting before them. A rancid scent filled the air, like decay and damp earth. Ethan grabbed Claire's hand and bolted for the door. It slammed shut. A force yanked Claire backward. She screamed as icy hands, many hands, clawed at her ankles. Fingernails scraped her skin, their grip cold and relentless. She thrashed, kicking at the unseen force, heart pounding. Then, Oliver spoke. It wasn't his voice. "Leave him." The voice was ancient, layered, as if multiple voices spoke at once. Claire turned her head, her breath hitching. Oliver stood in the center of the room, but something loomed behind him, a figure wrapped in shifting shadows, its face a writhing mass of mouths whispering in unison. The darkness stretched toward them, tendrils creeping like grasping fingers. "Leave the boy," it commanded again. Ethan lunged, pulling Claire free. He threw open the door, dragging her down the hallway. Behind them, the whispers surged into a shriek. The house shook, the walls splitting with unseen force, pictures crashing to the floor. They reached the front door. Ethan fumbled with the lock as Claire sobbed, staring back toward the hallway. Oliver stood there, watching them. His lips curled in the smallest of smiles. The thing behind him grinned, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, rows of teeth glistening in the dim light. The door flew open, and they stumbled into the night, into the safety of streetlights and the world that still made sense. They never looked back. The authorities found the house empty the next day. No child. No trace of the entity that had lurked within. Ethan and Claire moved across the country, changed their numbers, erased every trace of Oliver from their lives. But some nights, Claire still wakes to whispers in the dark. And a child's laughter that isn't there. Claire thought she had escaped it. That it was over. But one evening, as she stood in the bathroom brushing her teeth, she glanced up at the mirror. Oliver stood behind her. Her scream caught in her throat as the reflection showed his lips moving, whispering. But when she turned, there was nothing there. Just empty air. She barely had time to back away before the lights flickered, and the air turned ice cold. From the mirror, the whispering rose into a cacophony. And then, hands reached through the glass. She had time for one last scream before they pulled her in. Dr. Evelyn Carter had always been obsessed with time. Time was the one resource no one could replenish, the one thing even the wealthiest and most powerful could never buy more of. She often joked that if she could bottle time, she'd be the richest person on earth. But deep down, it wasn't a joke. It was her life's mission. Her breakthrough came in the form of a synthetic compound she called Somnox 9, a drug that promised to eliminate the need for sleep. The implications were staggering. Imagine a world where people could work, learn, and create without wasting a third of their lives unconscious. It was revolutionary. It was dangerous. And it was ready for human trials. The lab was a sterile, fluorescent-lit facility buried deep in the Nevada desert, far from prying eyes. The test subjects were 5 carefully selected individuals, each paid a small fortune to participate in the experiment. They were strangers to one another, chosen for their lack of pre-existing conditions and their willingness to sign airtight non-disclosure agreements. There was Marcus, a former soldier with a stoic demeanor, Priya, a med student with a sharp mind and a sharper tongue, Javier, a struggling artist looking for inspiration, Sarah, a single mother desperate for money, and Daniel, a thrill seeker who lived for the adrenaline rush. They were all different, but they shared one thing in common: they needed this. The first week was uneventful. The subjects were given daily doses of Somnox 9 and monitored around the clock. Blood tests, brain scans, and psychological evaluations were conducted hourly. The drug worked exactly as Dr. Carter had hoped. The subjects reported feeling more alert, more focused, and more energized than ever before. They didn't feel the need to sleep, not even a hint of drowsiness. It was a resounding success. But then, things started to change. Day 8, the first hallucination. It was Marcus who noticed it first. He was sitting in the common room, staring at the blank television screen, when he saw something move in the reflection. He turned around, but the room was empty. He shrugged it off, chalking it up to fatigue, even though he didn't feel tired. Later that night, Priya saw it too. She was in the bathroom, brushing her teeth, when she caught a glimpse of a figure standing behind her in the mirror. She spun around, but there was no one there. Her heart raced as she tried to rationalize what she'd seen. Maybe it was the fluorescent lights playing tricks on her eyes. Maybe it was the stress of being cooped up in the lab. But deep down, she knew it was something else. By the next morning, all 5 subjects had seen the figure. It was always the same, a tall, shadowy silhouette with no discernible features. It appeared in reflections, in the corners of their vision, and sometimes even in their dreams, though they weren't supposed to be dreaming at all. Dr. Carter dismissed their concerns. Hallucinations are a known side effect of sleep deprivation, she explained. Your brains are adjusting to the lack of REM cycles. It's nothing to worry about. But the subjects weren't convinced. The figure didn't feel like a hallucination. It felt real. And it felt malevolent. Day 12, the shared dream. The first shared hallucination happened during a routine cognitive test. The subjects were seated in a circle, each hooked up to an EEG machine to monitor their brain activity. Dr. Carter instructed them to close their eyes and focus on a series of images she projected on the wall. At first, everything was normal. But then, the images began to change. The serene landscapes and abstract shapes twisted into something darker, something wrong. The subjects opened their eyes, but the images didn't go away. They were no longer in the lab. They were standing in a vast, empty field under a blood-red sky. The figure was there, standing in the distance. It was closer now, close enough to see its elongated limbs and featureless face. It didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, like a weight pressing down on their chests. What the hell is this? Javier shouted, his voice trembling. It's not real, Priya said, though she didn't believe it herself. It's just a hallucination. We're all seeing the same thing because we've been primed by the drug. But then the figure moved. It didn't walk or run. It simply appeared closer, as if it had teleported. The subjects screamed and backed away, but no matter how far they went, the figure was always the same distance from them. And then, it spoke. Its voice was a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. You shouldn't be here, it said. This is not your place. The field began to dissolve, and the subjects found themselves back in the lab, gasping for breath. Dr. Carter was frantically checking their vitals, her face pale. What happened? She demanded. Your brain activity spiked off the charts. It was like you were all having the same nightmare. It wasn't a nightmare, Sarah said, her voice shaking. It was real. We were there. We saw it. Dr. Carter tried to reassure them, but her hands were trembling. She had never seen anything like this before. Day 15, the shadows grow. The hallucinations became more frequent and more intense. The figure no longer appeared only in reflections or dreams. It was everywhere. It lurked in the corners of the lab, watching them with its blank, featureless face. It whispered to them when they were alone, its voice echoing in their minds. "You're not supposed to be awake," it said. "You're trespassing." The subjects began to unravel. Marcus started carrying a knife he'd stolen from the lab kitchen, convinced the figure was real and would attack him at any moment. Priya stopped eating, afraid the food was contaminated. Javier locked himself in his room and refused to come out, muttering about the void and the gatekeepers. Sarah and Daniel clung to each other, their fear driving them closer together. Dr. Carter tried to maintain control, but even she wasn't immune to the effects of Somnox 9. She started seeing the figure too, though she refused to admit it. She doubled down on her research, convinced the drug could still work if she just tweaked the formula. But the more she worked, the more she felt the figure's presence looming over her, watching her every move. Day 20, the breaking point. The final straw came when Marcus attacked Javier. He claimed Javier had been possessed by the figure, that his eyes had turned black and his voice had changed. The others managed to pull him off, but the damage was done. Javier was badly injured, and Marcus was locked in a padded room, screaming about how the figure was coming for them all. Dr. Carter knew she had to end the experiment. She began preparing a counteragent to reverse the effects of Somnox 9, but it was too late. The figure had other plans. That night, the subjects were dragged into another shared hallucination. This time, they were in a labyrinth of endless corridors, the walls pulsating like living flesh. The figure was there, waiting for them. "You thought you could escape," it said. "But there's no escape. Not here." The subjects ran, but the corridors twisted and turned, leading them in circles. The figure pursued them, its presence growing stronger with every step. They could feel its breath on their necks, its cold, skeletal fingers brushing against their skin. One by one, they fell. Marcus was the first, his screams echoing through the labyrinth as the figure dragged him into the shadows. Priya was next, her sharp mind no match for the figure's relentless pursuit. Javier, Sarah, and Daniel followed, their cries fading into silence. Dr. Carter was the last. She tried to fight, to reason with the figure, but it was no use. It loomed over her, its featureless face inches from hers. "You thought you could cheat time," it said. "But time cheats no one." And then, everything went black. The lab was found abandoned a week later. The subjects were gone, their whereabouts unknown. Dr. Carter's notes were scattered across her desk, filled with frantic scribbles about the figure and the void. The final entry was a single sentence, written in shaky handwriting. "We were never supposed to wake up." To this day, no one knows what happened to the subjects of the sleep experiment. Some say they were driven mad by the drug and wandered into the desert. Others believe they were taken by something far worse, something that exists in the space between waking and dreaming. But one thing is certain, Somnox 9 was never tested again. The formula was destroyed, and all records of the experiment were sealed. Dr. Carter's research was buried, along with the truth about what happens when you try to cheat sleep. Because sleep isn't just a biological necessity. It's a barrier. A wall that separates us from something we were never meant to see. And once that wall is broken, there's no going back.